hour. When Europe marched to war in 1914, the shock traveled farther than any cannon blast. In Indochina, the summons went out across rice fields and city streets alike. The empire needed men. They came by the tens of thousands. Some as soldiers in horizon blue, most as laborious in rough wool and borrowed boots, stevedores, machinists, carpenters, cooks. They boarded steamers in Haiphong and Saigon, their names crossed off ledgers kept in a language many could not read, and disappeared into the turbulent heart of France. In Picardy and Champagne they dug trenches through chalk and mud, in ports along the Atlantic they unloaded munitions by the ton, in factories near Paris they learned the rhythm of modern industry, the clang of presses, the hiss of steam, the whistle that divided life into shifts. For the first time, many Vietnamese saw a world where ordinary men argued openly about wages and rights, where newspapers criticized ministers, where the word citizen was spoken without irony. They tasted a freedom that had not been offered in their own country, and though most would return home, a part of them would remain forever changed. The Great War ended in victory parades and monuments, and in promises made from podiums. American President Woodrow Wilson spoke of self-determination. Europe's statesmen nodded gravely at phrases about the rights of nations. In a conference room at Versailles, the future seemed, for a moment, negotiable. Among the onlookers in Paris was a thin, earnest Vietnamese using a borrowed suit and a borrowed name, Nguyen Ari Kuk, Nguyen the Patriot. He submitted a petition for Vietnam's modest freedoms, representation, press rights, equality before the law. It was a document couched not in threats, but in the very language the Allies had used to justify their triumph. No one answered. The petition vanished into archives and ashtrays. Its author learned a lesson that would shape the century. If the colonized were to be free, eloquence would not be enough. Back in Indochina, the old order resumed with practiced certainty. The tricolor flew, the short kept its files, and taxes were collected with the same cold efficiency. But those who had seen France, who had heard trade unionists on soapboxes and read radical pamphlets in mess halls, could not unsee or unhear. The empire had summoned them to save it. It had also, unintentionally, taught them how to question it. The 1920s opened like a curtain on a new stage. The cafes of Hanoi's old quarter, the cool verandas of Saigon, the boarding rooms near provincial train stations, all became classrooms without walls. Ideas moved from hand to hand: nationalism, constitutional reform, socialism, the dream of a republic where Vietnamese would no longer need permission to be themselves. Underground presses rattled to life. Pamphlets recited natural rights, editorials mocked injustice, poems braided the language of love with the language of liberty. Teachers held night schools under oil lamps, workers formed mutual aid societies that were not yet unions but wished to be. The French administrators sensed the change. They extended schooling but tightened censorship. They reformed a regulation here, and arrested a journalist there. A system that once felt effortless now required constant tending. In these years, opposition did not speak with one voice. Some sought gradual reform within French law, others placed their faith in modern education, still others concluded that only direct action would suffice. In 1930, officers of the Yen Bai garrison in the north, Vietnamese soldiers in the colonial army, mutinied, hoping to spark a wider revolt. It failed swiftly and bloodily, but it proved a vital point. Even those trained to defend the empire could imagine a world without it. Amid these cycles moved a man for whom defeat had been a tutor rather than a jailer. Nguyen Ari Kuk, the petitioner no one heard, had adopted another name and another task. He moved between Moscow and southern China, learning to weld politics to logistics, rhetoric to organization. Where others saw the empire as a wall, he studied it as a structure. Every structure has weaknesses, every weakness can be used. He was not alone. Across the colony, discrete networks crystallized, student circles that met to discuss forbidden books, railway crews who timed their grievances as carefully as a timetable, clerks who copied files twice, once for their superiors, once for the future. No single party yet owned the cause, but the cause was learning to own itself. French Indochina at the close of the 1930s was a paradox in sunlight. The governor's receptions glittered, Saigon cinemas premiered the latest reels, newspapers praised new roads and agricultural yields. And yet a single bad harvest could unravel entire districts, a single strike could paralyze a port, a single pamphlet could pass through 20 hands before morning. Then came the year that unstitched the seams of the old world, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, Europe was at war once more. France mobilized, conscription returned to Indochina, and fear, that patient ally of empire, resumed its work. Orders traveled outward from Paris, regulations multiplied, meetings were banned, presses seized, activists imprisoned. The short, cautious and methodical, believed that firmness would restore calm. It did not. It merely pressed discontent deeper, like embers buried in ash. In 1940, the blow fell. France itself collapsed under German attack, a new government at Vichy pledged cooperation with the conqueror, and in Indochina the colonial flag flew above offices whose instructions now came from strangers. Within months, another flag appeared, the sunburst of Imperial Japan, and with it the arithmetic of subjugation changed again. Two masters ruled one land. French administrators retained their desks and their pride, but the decisions that mattered were made in Tokyo. Japanese officers requisitioned rice, railways, and silence. The colony became a junction where empires exchanged orders. The Vietnamese became the messengers expected to obey them. The economy stretched like wire under a growing weight. Exports were commanded rather than negotiated, shortages foretold famine, the countryside felt itself yoked to appetites it did not share. When the monsoon failed, there was no margin. When one train was commandeered for troops, another could not carry grain. The mathematics of survival turned cruel. Yet in this tightening vice, an opportunity emerged for those who had learned to see cracks where others saw stone. If the colonizer now served a different colonizer, then the legitimacy of both could be questioned at once. The message that had long been whispered, that the empire was a costume and not a skin, found new listeners. The echoes of the Great War had begun as songs of sacrifice and victory. By the end of the 1930s they had become something else, instructions in how power works, and how it fails. Men who had shoveled snow from French platforms now shoveled rice from Vietnamese barns to Japanese boats and understood, with a clarity that needed no book, the true currency of empire. On the borders, another movement gathered its tools. In the mountains between Guangxi and Tonkin, messages crossed on mule tracks, in secret rooms, names were memorized and then forgotten, in camps that moved by night, a cadre drilled in both discipline and discretion. Their leader, the petitioner, the exile, the student of revolutions, was returning not as a supplicant but as an architect. What the Great War had taught him was simple, and it was devastating. Fine words do not liberate the conquered, organization does. And organization eats obstacles as hills eat fog. The stage was set for catastrophe and creation. With Europe in flames and Asia in chains, Vietnam would soon attempt what had seemed impossible, to tear the mask from empire in the very moment empire needed it most. But the price, when it came, would be paid first by the poor, in rice withdrawn, in fields untended, in the bitter arithmetic of famine. The war that had begun in Europe echoed now through 1,000 Vietnamese villages, not as gunfire but as silence at the bottom of an empty bowl. From that silence, a different sound would soon rise, the voice of a people who had learned to measure their rulers and found them wanting. Next, the occupation becomes a noose. Japan tightens its grip, French authority becomes a shadow, and a movement long in preparation steps from secrecy into history.